Hi, my name is Mark and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm showing you the final reveal of my sheep sweater. If you've been here in the last few weeks, then you've seen me working on the color work portion of this sweater, preparing to steek, to cut this garment open, and making several adaptations to the pattern to get a different type of garment, something that fits me differently that hopefully I'll really love. So today we'll go all the way from a swatch to a finished sweater with steeking, math, modifications, a recap of everything that went into this project. So if you're interested in seeing the final reveal, then stick around and let's get into it. So in front of me, I have a couple of the tools I use to get this project on the needles and later off the needles. So the first thing I did was work my swatch. I worked the swatch in the round. Even though it's a flat piece of fabric, I used a technique where you can carry the yarn across the back and work every row on the right side. There are other videos detailing this. I'll link one of them or two of them below. So I've got my floats across the back, and I also have these extra loops of yarn on one end from the technique of faux swatching in the round. And I wanted to make sure I knit this in the round, always knitting the right side of the fabric, so that I could get the best possible measure of my gauge. Once I had those numbers, I could do anything I wanted with my existing pattern from Rosa Pomar to change this project, to make sure that it fit me the way I wanted. In this case, I turned it from a traditional pullover sweater with sleeves to a vest, to a slipover, still with a crew neck. So I made several adjustments along the way. Things I changed included yarn weight. I worked out of a DK weight yarn instead of light fingering. In some moments I changed the chart. I changed how everything was spaced out or how much space it would take up. I also changed the type of garment. We went from a traditional sweater with sleeves to a slipover. So I took the sleeves off, I got rid of the drop shoulder element, I added some shoulder shaping, and I ended up with a vest that I'm pretty happy with. The tool that helped me with all of those changes was math. I like to call it knitter's math or crafter's math because I'm not a mathematician. I wouldn't fare well if I had to do actual equations with a lot of numbers and a lot of different outcomes. But in this case, I'm taking the most important measurements to me, which are my gauge measurements, how many stitches it takes me to get to an inch or a centimeter of knitting, and how many rows it takes me to get to an inch of height or length in the fabric. Once I have those numbers and I know that they are reliable, then I can do anything I want to adapt the pattern or create a pattern of my own. One very important factor for the swatch you make and the measurements you take is that you should treat the fabric in the same way you plan to treat the finished object. So if you plan to wash and block and wear the finished object, you should wash and block the swatch. The other thing I'll highlight at the beginning of this process is that it's never a bad idea to keep measuring. Keep measuring throughout the project. You could even block part of your project along the way to make sure you're happy with how it's measuring out and how the fabric is working up. Just to make sure you're not going to pour too many hours into something that isn't going to fit or work out the way you planned. So let's take a look at a little bit of this math and a little bit of what went on behind the scenes to get me to this finished project. Here we've got the cover page of the pattern from Rosa Pomar, and I've got a lot of notes on it. I've got my initial notes about needle size. I would use my initial gauge measurements for both stitch gauge and row gauge, and then it gets a little crazy. I have my makeshift schematic on one side, and then a lot of notes, things that are crossed out, things that are messy, measurements, stitch counts, rates of decrease. But you can see it all fits onto one page. So because I'm working from an existing pattern, a pattern that's charted beautifully, I don't have to start from scratch, which is why I still like to look for patterns from designers, look for a design, an element, something I'm excited about, even if I plan to make some changes. It's nicer for me to start from a really well thought out pattern and then execute whatever adjustments I want to make. In addition to taking my own measurements at the start of the project, I took measurements of a garment that I really like to wear. Sometimes we take our own measurements and we think we know how we want something to fit. We think, oh, I don't want too much ease, or yes, I want 10 inches of ease, just like the pattern recommends. But if you take something that you like to wear, something you think fits you well, flatters you, drapes the way you like, if you take your measurements from that garment, you might find the answer to be different than what you thought you knew. So in my case, I always think I want about 4 or 5 inches of ease. For something like this, I wanted a little bit more wiggle room. I want to be able to sit down, have a meal, kind of expand my stomach, my body as much as I want, and still have some room, still have some ease so that I feel a bit polished and put together. And in your case, things may be the opposite, especially if you are petite. 10 inches of ease, even 8 inches of positive ease might be too much depending on the garment and the project. So I think in addition to taking your own measurements, it's helpful to take a project you've made previously, something you've bought from the store, something you like the fit of, and to keep those measurements handy. It can save, again, a lot of time for your knitting, your crocheting, whatever your project is, knowing that in advance. I'll start with my schematic once again. So I have my little circumference at the bottom. I'm not adding any body shaping in this case. So I've got the basics. I've got the circumference at the bottom, which in this case was 60 inches, giving me about 5 or 6 inches of positive ease. And then I've got the length. The length here ended up being 14 to 15 inches from bottom hem to the bottom of the sleeve. And then something else that's important to me is the width of the shoulder. And this is truly the width measurement side to side, not the slant of the shoulder. I ended up with a shoulder that was about 4.5 inches before adding the ribbing at the sleeve cap and the neck opening. I've got other measurements to plug in, including the armhole depth, the width of the neck, and I'm including all of these measurements on my schematic and in my notes, both before and after the ribbing. So one neck opening size accounts for the actual opening after the ribbing is done around the collar. The other is what I need to do while I'm working the project before I go back to pick up stitches for that ribbing. So I have multiple versions of these measurements, and as I'm working the project, I'm trusting the math, I'm trusting the gauge that I worked before starting, but I'm also remeasuring. And if something is working out differently, if the fabric is heavier, if gravity is helping to increase the length or make the fabric behave differently than I imagined, I can take that into account and I can change course if needed. So after I have my ideal measurements in place, I'll translate everything to stitch count. So in my case, my 4 or 4.5 inches of shoulder ended up being something like 24 to 26 stitches that I needed left in my shoulder. So I could do the other adjustments, the decreasing for the upper body, any shaping I needed, knowing the stitch count that I need to reach. Now that I've got my numbers in place and my vision for the project, I can carry on with the knitting. As I'm working this project, because it's color work in the round, it's steeked. So we're working steek panels that will allow us later to cut the project open, cutting open the armhole space, also cutting open a little tab at the front that helped account for any shaping along the neck. I talk about this technique in other videos, and there are plenty of great resources on YouTube for steeking if you're curious. The reason this project is steeked is because I have continuous color work all over the sweater that runs all the way to the top of the project. So instead of having to split at the armhole openings and then work that color work on the right side and the wrong side, we can keep working in the round. And this is something that Rosa Pomar calls for in the design. It's also something I like to do with a lot of projects that don't call for it. If I'm doing color work, if I'm doing really detailed texture work, sometimes I choose to continue working in the round just so I can see everything from the right side of the project. And as a little reminder of why that makes such a difference, from the right side of the project, it's pretty easy to see what's happening in the pattern. You can tell where the legs of the sheep are. You can tell generally what should be happening by glancing at the project. Of course, you're following a pattern, following a chart, but parts of it become easy to recognize, keeping you in the right place and hopefully allowing you to make fewer mistakes. If we look at the wrong side of the fabric, it gets confusing. I could not confidently tell you where I am in the pattern. I can still see, let me flip it over so we can really see what's happening. I can still see the general outline of the sheep. I can tell that the head is coming down here, 2 legs, something ambiguous, 2 legs, but I wouldn't be able to tell stitch by stitch when I need to change my colors. I think it's much easier to look at color work from the right side of the project and keep your place. So that's why I'm steeking in addition to the instructions given by the designer. I think it makes the knitting process much more enjoyable for an all-over stranded colorwork project like this one. At this time, I'm going to pass it back to Mark from earlier in the week to reinforce the steeks in this project and cut them open. I'll see you in a bit. All right, it's time to reinforce these steeks. So in front of me, I've got my sheep sweater, which looks a little bit funny. The sweater began like a normal sweater. I was working it bottom up. So from the bottom up, we have a normal portion of fabric. It's open, I could try it on, you can pull it over your head or step into it. You can make sure that it's fitting the right way or take good measurements as you're working. So that's the start. When I reached the point where my sleeve should start, the bottom of my sleeve should appear, it was time for me to bind off or set aside a number of stitches. So in my case, I set aside, I don't know, something like 18 stitches total. So I have a completed edge here, and then above it, the fabric reconnects and I have my steek channel. And my steek channel is used columns of stripes. I could have used a checkerboard arrangement or really anything I felt in the moment, but I wanted to keep things consistent, keeping me on track with these columns. So this section here is not part of the sweater. Everything you see here in these columns will be folded under. It will be folded to the inside of the fabric all alongside the armhole opening. So that was the setup. When I reached the right length of sweater for the bottom part of my body, I bound off the number of stitches needed for the bottom part of that armhole, and then immediately cast on new stitches to become the bottom of this steek panel. So from that point on, I can't try the sweater on. There's no opening at the sleeve. The fabric is joined via the steek, and it means any shaping, anything happening here in the upper body makes the shape go a little off the rails. So to review, the bottom part of the sweater is normal. It's standard. This is a pullover sweater vest, so I didn't need a steek at the front like I would for a cardigan. So all of that looks very standard, very traditional. Once I get to the underarms, I bind off or set aside my stitches and then cast on new stitches to become these armhole steeks. And again, that allows me to keep working in the round. I don't have to interrupt any of this color work. I don't have to work the pattern flat. I can just keep going as if I were still knitting the bottom portion of the body. Specifically for this sweater, I have armhole shaping at the sides, bringing the garment in so it fits my shape. And I also have a crew neck with shaping to make sure that that front neck depth is right. I don't want the sweater to be all the way up on my neck. So that gives us an extremely tapered piece of fabric. Even though the top sections here will eventually end up further out where my natural shoulders are, the fabric we have, because of the front neck stitches, because of this additional steek here, and the steeks at the armhole, causes this fabric to come in almost like a pyramid. We're tapering up and up this mountain. If I straighten things out, you'll see that the stitches are all the same. Nothing is shifting on the fabric itself, and once we cut these steeks open, everything will line up. Everything will line up vertically. There's not going to be any slanting in the actual garment. It just appears to do that because of the steeks, because of where this fabric is being gathered and cinched in. So I have 3 steeks for this project, 1 at each armhole opening and 1 at the front neck. Any shaping I did at the back neck didn't require a steek because I waited to do my shaping until I had finished the last bit of the colorwork chart. And we'll look at that more when the whole thing's finished and I can actually try it on and we can look at it in a normal sort of way. My shoulders are joined with a 3-needle bind off from the wrong side, so I have a nice strong seam here at the shoulders. And if I trace the shoulder to the outer arm, my finger can come through it because the steek is bound off just below that. So that gives me a place for my scissors to go. When it's time to cut this armhole steek, I've got safe space at the bottom from the bound off stitches, and also at the top where I meet the shoulder, nothing is connected. So we'll reinforce this steek, we'll cut everything, but we're not at risk of cutting live stitches or what could become live stitches. Everything was carefully set aside so that the steeks are just in place while we knit. As soon as we cut them and fold them to the inside of the fabric, everything else will look hopefully perfect. So let's reinforce. There are several ways you can reinforce a steek, and we've talked about this in other videos. Sometimes I go to my sewing machine if I have a really long steek running up the entire front of a cardigan. If I'm ever working with a fiber that is slick, that will not cling to itself, that won't felt readily, then I use my sewing machine. I have it on hand. I've experimented with different stitches. I feel comfortable and confident that the fabric is not going to get eaten by the machine. So if I had a steek running up the entire length of this, I would probably go to my sewing machine and reinforce there. I could also go in by hand and sew a reinforcement. I could go in and crochet a reinforcement. In this case, technically I don't have to do anything. I could cut these steeks, and because they're plenty wide, I have 7 stitches in each steek, I could just cut right up the center of the steek. The stitches right next to it that I'm cutting are going to flail around, kind of release themselves a little bit, but because the fiber is a non-superwash wool, because it is a little bit toothy, because the scales along the fiber cling to the next, I'm not at risk of it completely unraveling. That's why we have 7 stitches in our steek. If I had 3 stitches and I cut, then I'm much closer to my actual fabric that I want to keep intact. So that would be more dangerous. I could just cut this, and with time, with wear, with agitation, that edge, the cut bits of the steek, would start to felt. I think this wool is not as toothy, not quite as clingy or sticky as other wools out there, so I'm going to go in with some reinforcement. It also gives me good peace of mind. It's not going to take long to do. I'm going to needle felt this with a needle felting tool, and so we'll do that here together, and you'll see how it transforms the fabric into truly a felted strip that is at 0 risk of starting to come undone. This tool is from Clover. It's got a protective guard. It also has a lock so that when it's locked, you can't press it down. You can't get the guard to release. When you unlock it, the guard will release, and I'm showing you this just for learning purposes because it's so sharp and scary. Don't do this at home. The needles are barbed. You can see the little glinty textured teeth along those needles. That's what's going to help us rapidly agitate and felt the fabric. So the guard helps us not to accidentally nick our hands, and we want to make sure we're working on some sort of supportive surface. So I have a big old block of styrofoam. You could use a felting pad. You could use your own block of cardboard. You could use sort of like a pin cushion balled up of felt or fiber. There are all sorts of things out there that you could make yourself, find easily, or purchase. And I'm going to make sure to put this in between the layers of my fabric. I don't want to accidentally needle felt through multiple layers and felt the fabric together. I want to make sure I'm isolating just the steek. So we shimmy this styrofoam block inside our sweater until it's supporting this front neck steek. This steek only has 5 stitches in it because I don't want quite as much bulk right along the neckline. Because I've steeked before, because I've steeked with this exact fiber and this technique, I'm confident that 5 stitches will be okay for me. If it's your first time steeking, steek with more stitches. Make sure you have a happy, secure number to allow you to do whatever reinforcing you want to try. So now, keeping the tool nicely vertical, I'll place it on the fabric and press down. And I'll hear the nice crunch, and I'll see if I can get a little bit of this crunch for you. The nice crunch of those barbed needles sinking down into the styrofoam, and then when we pull it back out, that's what's doing most of the felting. Those barbs are then catching the wool and helping to rapidly agitate this targeted piece of fabric. And that's what we do over and over again, stabbing, 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 and we'll start to felt this fabric. It's important as you do this to keep your tool, whether it's a single needle for needle felting or a tool like this with several needles, to keep it straight up and down. These needles are skinny, they are fragile, and so if you're going at an angle, it's likely that they could snap, they could break, and you could end up with a stray needle flying through the air, or something stuck in your support material or stuck in your fiber that you have to pull out. And again, these needles are covered in little barbs, so you don't want to have to handle them, you don't want to lose them in your workspace or your home. So keeping things nicely vertical, we just repeatedly stab the fabric. The other important thing to remember as you're doing this is to move your fabric. Occasionally lift it and replace it or scoot it to another part of your support so that it doesn't felt into your support, whatever you're using. Now let's take a peek at the wrong side of the fabric and see if anything is happening. Hopefully you can see that along the center of this line, I'm getting fuzzy felted fabric. The stitches next to it look just like strands of yarn, but here in the center, it's starting to turn almost gray. The two shades of brown are combining and it's becoming felted. It's getting thicker. The stitches are starting to disappear. So from the right side, to my eye, nothing looks different. And again, that's because the barbs of the needles are catching the fabric on their way out. So the side of the fabric that's being felted is the underside. Sometimes if I'm feeling antsy and I can't tell if the fabric is starting to felt at all, I'll flip the fabric over, lay it on the support, and then needle felt from the opposite side. And after we do a little bit of this, I'll show you what that looks like from the right side. Okay, when I flip that over, now we can see the felting on the front side of the fabric. And we start to lose the clear definition of the stitches. We can see down here the clear V's of this column. When we get to the top of it, they start to get a little hazy. They're covered up, they're almost congealing on themselves. And that's where the felting is happening. So to make sure I'm felting in the right spot and I'm not going over into my beautiful colorwork sections, I'm going to do my work from the front side, from the right side of the fabric. But when I want to see the felting progress, I'll lift it up, look at the back, and then see how secure, how felted this bit of the steek has become. All right, that's what we have now. When I feel this, it's clearly thicker along the center of the steek, and I think it's sufficiently felted along the back. So I'm ready to snip this open. I tried to keep my columns so that I would have a clear guide. In this case, we have 5 stitches in the steek, starting with the cream color. So 1, 2, cream is 3 in the center, 4, 5. My plan is to cut directly up this line of cream stitches. And that will give me equal parts of steek, equal width, and equal number of stitches on each half to fold under and then tack down to the fabric. So here we go. I've got good sharp scissors. I think it's nice to use a short pair of scissors. These blades are only about 1.5 inches long. Sometimes I'll use small snips. I don't want to go in with a huge pair of scissors because one snip could cover several inches of fabric, and just in case I'm not lined up, just in case I have multiple layers stacked upon themselves, I don't want to accidentally cut into good fabric. That would be a big headache because you'd have to go in and try to secure all of that knitting. So I've got my layers separated by my little styrofoam block. If you've used a different method of reinforcement or you don't need to reinforce, make sure you have something to divide your layers. whether that's a piece of paper, a notebook, it could be your pattern, it could be a piece of cardboard. It can be scary to have two layers stacked on top of each other and try to trust that you're only cutting into the top layer. And in this case, my fabric is fairly dark, so I've got good lighting, I've got my little block to separate, and a small pair of scissors so I can do several short snips. So let's cut. Trying to line up with that center column of white, I'll do my first couple of snips, making sure that nothing else is getting cut. And there we have it. It's exciting. So if I look at the edge of this fabric, it looks pretty secure. If I were to really pick at it and pull at it, yes, I think I could get some strands to come loose, but we're still about a ½ inch away from my good fabric. So it would take a lot of pulling, a lot of manipulation. I would really have to try to mess this up. When we look at that wrong side of the fabric, it's still fuzzy. It's still felted. We have a kind of solid edge of fabric that no longer looks like the regular strands of yarn. So that's keeping everything from moving at all. Now I'll pull this block out, and you can see the top of the sweater is free to spread out. So already, just releasing that front neck steek, the sweater looks kind of like it's supposed to. These armhole steeks are going to give us armholes. They're going to open it up for a place for the arms to go through so I can try it on. But opening up this front neck steek now has allowed the sweater to get much closer to its finished form. So what happens now? Now that I've got this neck opening complete, I have live stitches at the front neck. I've got my steeks sitting on the side that will get folded underneath to help complete that neck shaping. And then we go all the way up to the shoulder and over to the back neck. Those stitches are also temporarily on hold. So at this point, I'll get my needles, the right needle size for my ribbing. I'll pick up the live stitches and then go into the edge. I have a selvage edge of one column of stitches here. I'll go in and pick up my stitches all along the selvage, around the back, picking up the live stitches, and then again picking up the selvage at the other side of the neck. Then I can work my ribbing. I can do however many rows, however much length, whatever pattern I need, and the top of the sweater will be complete. The true final step of any steeked project is to go in and do something with your steek. It can just sit there. It could just sit there on the inside of the fabric and kind of flap around or rest on your collarbone. A lot of people like to tack it down. Sometimes I'll secure my steek with needle felting. Once the fabric is folded under where it needs to be and the ribbing and the blocking is complete, I'll go in with my felting tool and gently felt from the front side, because you saw it didn't really felt up or change the look of the front of the stitches, but it felted the back side. So sometimes I'll go in and gently felt, taking my time so that I don't mess up the fabric, and see if I can do enough felting to tack down the steek so that it doesn't move. I'm going to repeat these steps with the armhole openings. I'll get them secured, reinforced, and then we'll come back and we'll cut them here together. After that, I'll be able to try on the sweater, make sure I'm happy with things before I go in to pick up those stitches and do the final bit of ribbing. All right, there we have it. Now it looks much more like a sweater. I'll try it on and then we'll see how it looks pre-blocked and before we get the ribbing on for the armholes and the neck opening. Anything that I had to account for or make a decision on seems to have worked out so far, and I owe it all to the math. This isn't something that I could just wing. I don't think that I could take haphazard measurements along the way and hope or assume that they will work out. I think when you're working with hundreds of stitches in one round and a colorwork chart or detailed texture, you have to have some sort of plan or the ability to check in along the way to make sure things are going to work out. So far, so good. I'm really happy with things in this slightly unfinished state before we have the ribbing at the neck and the armholes and before we've blocked everything. So at this point, I can go in, picking up stitches around the armhole openings and the neck opening, and working my final bits of ribbing. And after that's all set, it's time to give this a final bath. Before blocking everything, I took a few minutes to weave in my ends. Unless I think it's likely that I'll need to pull something out, I go ahead and I weave in all of my ends before blocking, because during the blocking process, the yarn puffs up, it blooms, it relaxes, and it helps to secure and lock those ends in. So again, if I don't think I'll need to pull something back out, I weave everything in so that blocking can be the final step of the process. We'll leave this to dry for a couple of days, and after that, I'll do the final reveal. We'll get to take a look at how this all turned out. All right, everything's dry. I've got it in front of me, inside out, and we're going to take a look at these Steeks. Before I put it on, before we do our final sort of fashion show off of the project, let's take a look at how things turned out with the steeking. I think for a lot of people, steeking is scary. Maybe people don't understand why they would want to do it. But as I've said, if you're working a colorwork project, a really detailed project where it makes sense to stay on the right side of your knitting and carry colors all the way around, it's an amazing technique. So here, along this armhole, we've got a pretty wide bit of a steek. This was very safe and secure. This steek had 7 stitches in it originally, so half of it is essentially 3.5 stitches. That half stitch sort of disappears because that's where we cut. So we have 3 stitches, 3 columns. We have cream, brown, cream. And because we needle felted it, it's not going anywhere. You can see that final column right next to the cut edge is still well intact. And if I flip it over, you'll see that felted edge, the felted underside, which is pretty secure. We get a couple of stray strands there, but again, they're not going anywhere. So we'll have half of the steek on one side of the armhole, and then on the other side of the armhole opening, there's the other half of those initial 7 stitches. So the steek is fine as it is. Nothing else has to be done, and I'll leave it like this for the next week or two while I decide exactly what I might do, what I potentially would do to finish this off. Sometimes I've gone in with my needle felting tool from the right side of the fabric and done a bit of light felting so that this gets tacked down. Right now it's loose. It could open up. Because of the structure of the garment, it's pretty solid in place, but if I needle felted from the front, it would tack it in place. It wouldn't go anywhere. The other option is that I could go in with some needle and thread and just tack that down, so it's not causing any sort of ripple or pucker if it gets turned up while I'm wearing it. And the final choice that I know of is to use a ribbon. And I don't know if I would want to use a ribbon here at the armhole. I think using a ribbon to cover the steek is a beautiful choice for a cardigan where you'd really see it. Here, I don't know if it's worth the ribbon. So if I end up going out and shopping for some nice ribbon, I might test covering the steek here at the armhole and then move on to some of my cardigan projects. But it's fine as it is, pretty secure. We've got the same situation at the other armhole opening, except at the top, I have a little extra fabric from my bind off. It's kind of like a nub. I don't love that. So I might snip that off and reinforce the top with a little more felting. we'll see. That's probably going to get snipped off. And if for some reason I had worked an enormous steek, or I was repurposing, kind of reshaping the armhole, and I had a lot of extra fabric, I could trim that. I could trim it and reinforce with whatever method I had chosen for the project. So steeking really is flexible. It's safe to do if you're aware of the fiber content of your materials and then you follow through with appropriate reinforcing. You can steek anything. If you're using cotton, if you're using silk, superwash wool, you can steek with strong reinforcement. You can go in with a sewing machine and really make sure everything is reinforced, and then when you cut, things will sort of ripple and fray, but as soon as it hits that reinforced sewn line, everything will be secure. I think you have to be more careful, really make sure you've done your due diligence for the preparation in that scenario. With wool, a non-superwash woolly wool, it's pretty safe, pretty sturdy. The only thing you have to be careful of is cutting in the right place. If you cut into your fabric, it can be a catastrophe, but as long as you stay on track and you go carefully and slowly, I think it's nearly foolproof. I can't say it's foolproof because who knows, you could end up with some crazy situations, but I'm a fan. I recommend it. So I hope that if you're someone who's considering steeking a project or working a project that would benefit from a steek, that you'll give it a try. Make sure you take account of the materials, of the reinforcing, of all of those steps, and I hope it's really successful for you. Let's take a look at the last steek, which was along the neck opening. This steek is kind of funny. All it did was allow us to shape the neck, which I think ended up being shaped beautifully, while keeping all of that color work. I didn't want to have to separate these two shoulders and work right side, wrong side while doing the decreases. I wanted to keep everything together, making sure I'm still working in the round, keeping track of all of that shaping simultaneously, as well as the color work. So we just have our two little steeks. And I put fewer stitches in this steek. We only had 5 stitches across instead of 7. So here our steek looks like 2 stitches, a cream stitch and a brown stitch, but it's equally felted. It's laying down already. It's not trying to come up. So here, I don't think I will do anything. I think with wear, this will stay right where it needs to be, and it's not terribly bulky. If I'd had a larger steek, like 7 stitches or 8 or 9 stitches, I think I would feel that more. And because it's right along the neck, I don't know that I wanted that, which is why I chose a smaller number for the steek. And I think I mentioned earlier, I've worked with this fiber before, I've steeked this fiber before, so I was confident 5 stitches would be okay. All right, so that's it. That's it on the wrong side. Now for the final reveal. Thanks for your patience. Thanks for coming along for the journey, and I hope that you like the sweater just as much as I do. Thanks so much for sticking around to the end of this video. I've had a lot of fun with this project, and last week we talked about failures, things that just didn't turn out for various reasons of my own doing. So this week I'm happy to share a success, and more importantly, why it was a success and how I got there. Some of these tools that I use most every time I make a project. So as always, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'm always happy to hear from you, to hear what you're working on, and I'd love to know if you steek, if you've been steeking for years, if you like to use the technique, or if it's something you've never tried. And if so, would you try it? Do you have any projects out there, any patterns, any designs that have been tempting you, but maybe you haven't wanted to tackle the steek? I think you should do it, and I want to hear about it. As always, you can find me over on Instagram and Ravelry at MakerMarkKnits. You can get in touch with me there. And I have upcoming Patreon Zooms for this month. Over on Patreon, we have a lot of fun sharing our projects, getting to know each other, answering questions, and building a community. I think it's a great place for us to meet face to face. So if you're interested in joining that community, you can find the upcoming dates on the screen, and you can find information on how to get there in the description box and in the comments below. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, I would of course appreciate you doing that. I've got lots of projects to finish, lots of things to share here on the channel, especially now that things are getting cooler here in Northeastern Ohio where I live. As always, thanks for choosing to be here with me today. Happy knitting, happy crocheting, happy crafting to you, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one. Bye.